To understand the physics behind the electromagnetic train, it is important to understand magnets and magnetic fields. A magnet is made out of two poles, a north pole and a south pole. All magnets must have these two poles, and it is impossible for a magnet to have only one pole. When splitting a magnet in half, you do not end up with a north pole and a south pole. You actually end up with two separate magnets, each with its own north and south pole. Keep splitting and you will eventually end up with a single electron. Turns out, this electron has its own north and south pole. This essentially means that an electron is a magnet. The importance of these poles is that opposite poles attract. A north pole will attract the south pole, and a south pole will attract a north pole. If you have played with magnets before, you will know that sometimes magnets seem to push each other away. This is because the same poles repel each other. A north pole and a north pole will repel each other, and a south pole and a south pole will repel each other. Now that you understand the basics of magnets, let's move on to magnetic fields. A magnetic field is the area around a magnet that will exert a magnetic force on objects that come in contact with it. It is very important to understand how to interpret the diagram of this magnetic field. The object in the center is a magnet with north and south poles. The lines around it are the magnetic field, represented in vectors. These vectors represent the force that would be exerted on a north pole anywhere in the magnetic field. It is extremely important to understand that these diagrams of magnetic fields are purely hypothetical, because it is impossible to have only a north pole. The diagram is based on a singular north pole, so it is only hypothetical. Notice that as the vectors get further away from the magnet, the distance between each vector tends to increase. This is because, as you get further from the magnetic force decreases in strength. This means the closer the vectors are to each other, the stronger the force. This will be covered in greater detail during the presentation. As stated before, the vectors represent the force on a north pole anywhere in the magnetic field. So how does one create this diagram? Putting a north pole particle in the magnetic field, the blue line represents the repulsion it feels from the north pole of the magnet, and the red line represents the attraction it feels from the south pole of the magnet. If we use vector addition, we can determine that the net force on the north pole is the purple line. If you do this process in every possible location, you will end up with a magnetic field diagram. As we already know, when a current runs through an object, the object generates a magnetic field. This new magnetic field diagram for this electromagnet is slightly different from permanent magnets, but the same principal concepts apply. The vectors still show how a north pole would react to this magnetic field. We will go over how to find the direction of this magnetic field using the curl rule during our presentation. In the electromagnetic train, the magnets and wire coil are all conductors, and they essentially create a circuit with the battery providing the current. This results in a current going through the copper coil and the copper coil becoming an electromagnet. We have already seen what the magnetic field of a wire carrying current looks like. When the wire is shaped into a coil, also known as a solenoid, the magnetic field looks something like this. With the wires coiled so closely together, the magnetic force of the coil is actually very strong. This is because the magnetic fields are all condensed together, making the overall magnetic field of the solenoid very strong. Notice that on the inside of the coil, the vectors are closer to each other compared to the outside, meaning that the magnetic force is much stronger on the inside of the solenoid. It is important to note that the magnetic field of the solenoid is the important magnetic field to consider when looking at the electromagnetic train, because the magnetic field of the train does not affect itself.